jurisdiction. It only has an appellate jurisdiction. Now, please remember that a court which does not have jurisdiction cannot be conferred jurisdiction by the consent of the parties, or neither can a jurisdiction be taken away by the consent of the parties. Is this video okay?
Ma'am, this is okay, all okay. You continue, ma'am. Actually, I have to see the operations of this lecture, so therefore you continue, ma'am.
Okay, okay. So thing was, neither estoppel nor consent nor waiver can either grant or take away jurisdiction. So now please understand, there is a basic difference between irregular exercise of jurisdiction and lack of jurisdiction. Irregular exercise of jurisdiction is where a court has jurisdiction to try a case, but it decides a case either rightly or wrongly. There you say it is an irregular exercise of jurisdiction. There you feel that apparently it has been decided wrongly. You say that it is an irregular exercise of jurisdiction. But where the court lacks inherent jurisdiction, the decree coming from that court is a nullity. A decree coming from a court which has exercised jurisdiction irregularly is only does not make the decree a nullity. Please understand the basic difference. So irregular exercise of jurisdiction does not make the decree a nullity, whereas a decree passed by a court which lacks jurisdiction is a nullity. Now, this can be set up at any time, even at the stage of execution. It can be said that the decree was passed by a court without jurisdiction. Now, who decides it? Who decides whether the court has jurisdiction or does not have jurisdiction? Now, court in A.R. Antule I'll repeat it. The Supreme Court in A.R. Antule versus R.S. Nayak had held that the civil court has inherently its own power to decide its own jurisdiction. So if you raise an objection before a court that this honorable court does not have jurisdiction, that court itself will decide whether it has jurisdiction or it does not have jurisdiction. That comes within the court's purview. So a civil court has inherent jurisdiction to decide this particular question of jurisdiction, whether it, under the facts of the case, it has jurisdiction or it does not have jurisdiction. It is not to be decided by any other court. It is to be decided by the same court where the suit has been filed. Now, as I was saying, consent of parties can neither take away jurisdiction nor confer jurisdiction. Now, as you know, one of the latest cases decided by Supreme Court, I'll talk about one of the important cases, Harshad Chimanlal Modi versus DLF Universal. This is AIR 2005 Supreme Court. The Supreme Court specifically said that the agreement between the parties conferring jurisdiction on court of some place which would otherwise have no jurisdiction is a contract which is opposed to public policy. It is not considered to be a good contract as far as that particular clause is concerned. So conferring jurisdiction on a place which inherently lacks jurisdiction is not considered to be good. And in this case, the Supreme Court was very clear and categorical in stating where, in this particular case, the case related to an immovable property which was situated in Gurgaon. And the case was filed in Delhi. The Supreme Court said there is no way that the Delhi courts will have jurisdiction over this case. I'll keep discussing this case when I come to section 16 again. Now, having said that the consent neither confers nor take away jurisdiction, please remember that parties to an international trade agreement, though, may agree to a jurisdiction which is a neutral jurisdiction, which is neither my country nor your country. So therefore, in strict sense, in the terms that we are dealing with in CPC, where nothing has happened, yet that a particular case may get jurisdiction because the trade agreement says so. Now, this was held by Supreme Court in Modi Entertainment.
I request the listeners to kindly mute. Ma'am, you can continue.
So this was held in Modi Entertainment versus WSG Cricket Private Limited, wherein the Supreme Court said that where the questions are relating to an international trade agreement, the parties may agree to a place which does not have jurisdiction. Because basically, in that sense, you are giving jurisdiction to a neutral place. But otherwise, when we are dealing with a case nationally, which we are dealing with a case which is happening, which is taking place in within the boundaries of India, then this is not applicable. And the landmark case, of course, you know, Hakam Singh versus Gammon India Limited, wherein the court had said that where more cases have jurisdiction, more courts have jurisdiction, you can limit the jurisdiction to 1 or 2 courts, but you cannot confer jurisdiction to a court which does not have jurisdiction at all. I'll repeat myself. You cannot confer jurisdiction to a court which does not have jurisdiction at all. This is Hakam Singh versus Gammon India Limited, in which case the Supreme Court had said that if multiple courts have jurisdiction, then one of the courts can be exclusively given jurisdiction. Now, what is important in such cases is that the words such as exclusive, alone, etc. should have been used. In those contracts, the words alone, exclusive, or ousting the jurisdiction are excluded. For example, the word excluded. So the courts at Delhi are excluded or would not have jurisdiction to try the present matter. These kind of statements in the contract would give jurisdiction, or would rather restrict jurisdiction to one place. Not give jurisdiction, but restrict jurisdiction to one place. Likewise, the Supreme Court in ABC Laminate versus AP agencies had held that such agreements are totally, they are not ultra vires. These are totally fine. But what should be seen in such agreements is whether the intention of the parties are clear. The parties wanted the dispute to be heard at one place. That means the agreement should be unambiguous, explicit, clear, specific. Now, this was also then held in New Moga Transport Company versus United India Insurance Company. Nitesh, would you want me to give the citations as well?
Ma'am, yes. It would be good if you can give the citations.
Okay. So, New Moga Transport Company versus United India Insurance Company is AIR 2004, Supreme Court 2154. ABC Laminate versus AP agencies is AIR 1989, Supreme Court 1239.
Okay, ma'am, you can continue.
Hakam Singh versus Gammon India Limited, AIR 1971, Supreme Court 740. And the judgment which I referred to talking about the neutral court was Modi Entertainment, was AIR 2003, Supreme Court 777. So I'll continue now.
Ma'am, A.R. Antule citation.
A.R. Antule citation.
And H.C. Modi also.
A.R. Antule citation is AIR 1988, Supreme Court 1531. And Harsha Chimanlal Modi is AIR 2005, Supreme Court 4446.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now, can I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. So I was still at original or appellate jurisdiction of a court. Like I said, a court may have both or may have one. And I gave you examples. For example, Delhi High Court has both. And Delhi District Courts have both original as well as appellate jurisdiction, but not so particularly in Allahabad High Court. Now, the pecuniary limits of the civil court are laid down in the Relevant Courts Act, which I told you in Delhi is Punjab Court Act 1980, which still governs and extendable to Delhi. So at present, the jurisdiction of a small cause court in Delhi is 10,000 rupees. Of a civil judge is 3 lakh rupees. And of a district judge is that of from 3 lakhs, 1 rupee to 2 crores. And above 2 crores and above is Delhi High Court, pecuniary jurisdiction. Now, how is a jurisdiction determined? A jurisdiction is normally determined by the allegations made by the plaintiff in his plaint. The allegations made by the plaintiff in his plaint decides which is the forum which court should entertain his plaint. Now, basically, there are 3 rules which determine jurisdiction. Now, I'm talking about the rules. So, one, which is contained in section 6 of CPC, it says no court shall entertain any suit the amount or value of the subject matter of which exceeds its pecuniary jurisdiction. Okay. Then the next is section 9. Civil courts to try all matters of a civil nature unless expressly or impliedly barred. And third, every suit shall be instituted in the court of the lowest grade competent to try it, which is section 15 of CPC. So I'll begin with section 9. Now, in section 9, civil courts are to try all suits of a civil nature. So, civil nature, I think most of you sitting here have been my students, so would remember that civil nature is basically a right to an office or a right to a property, or now if these kind of rights exist, am I audible, Nitish?
Ma'am, you are audible. You can continue. There is no problem. If it is not audible, I will inform you accordingly.
Okay. So civil nature basically involves determination of civil rights. Any question of property, any question of an office is basically a question of civil nature. And any question where non-observance of those rights would entail some penalties is a suit of a civil nature. And explanations take it a little further, wherein they say that these questions of a civil nature may also include some questions relating to where the right to an office or right to a property entails talking about religious rites or ceremonies. Okay, as of now, I'm not talking about religious rites or ceremonies. I'll continue with expressly barred or impliedly barred. So what is an express bar? How are matters expressly barred by the jurisdiction of civil court? Expressly bar is those statutes where other statutes specifically say that the jurisdiction of the civil court is barred. I'll give you examples. Now, for example, the Income Tax Act, the Family Courts Act, the Recovery of Debt Due to Banks and Financial Institutions Act. These are all acts which specifically say that now, to the extent their preamble provides, the jurisdiction of civil court is barred. Now, how do we say that a matter is impliedly barred and is not entertainable by civil court? When basically it is barred on account of general public policy. For example, a suit cannot lie in a criminal court. An implied bar is also raised when it provides for a special remedy to an aggrieved party. Now, let me specifically talk to you about Consumer Protection Act in this regard. Consumer Protection Act is in addition and not in derogation of civil court, right? But since it provides an entire machinery, that means it provides an entire machinery of or hierarchy of courts to entertain consumer matters. So we have district forum, we have state commission, we have national commission. The intention of the legislature is very clear that the jurisdiction of civil court is impliedly barred. That the civil courts should not entertain these matters, that the civil courts, if these matters come, should refer these matters to consumer courts. Now, this was specifically held by Supreme Court in Dulabhai versus State of Madhya Pradesh. This is an old judgment which we have continued to discuss. So I'll just give you a line from that particular judgment, wherein it was held that where there is no express bar, it is necessary to examine the remedies and the scheme of the statute, which creates a new special right or liability and provides for the determination of the right or liability. It may be held that the jurisdiction of the civil court is impliedly barred, but at the same time, it is a settled position that if the statute is ultra vires, then these tribunals cannot determine whether cannot determine its own wires. Then that can only be determined by the constitutional courts. Now, having said this, that there is an implied bar or an express bar, these bars are not to be readily inferred by civil court. If these should be exclusively, it should be exclusively there and very apparently clear to the court, and then only we say that the jurisdiction of the civil court is barred.
And can we have the citation of Dulabhai?
This is the
State of MP.
Okay, just give me a minute, please. This is AIR 1969, Supreme Court 78.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Ma'am, please repeat again. I'm so sorry.
AIR 1969, Supreme Court 78.
Thank you.
Now, there are certain matters which are not to be entertained by court. For example, caste matters are not to be entertained by courts. Or where a person is told to, that everybody from a caste is contributing to a particular cause and you have to also contribute, and the person does not contribute and there is some sanction against him. These kind of matters are not to be entertained by courts. These are not coming within the expression suits of a civil nature. Now I will be coming to section 16. Section 16 talks about, section 16 to 18 talks about jurisdiction relating to immovable property. So wherever the subject matter of the dispute, subject matter is basically what the object of the suit is. So subject matter is wherever the subject matter is an immovable property, then in such cases, wherever the immovable property is situated, the suit has to be filed in that jurisdiction. This is as per section 16, and 17 and 18 only takes it little further and helps us to determine in which of these courts supposedly a case may relate to multiple properties. I'll come to it when I do section 17. So as of now, okay, I'll begin with section 16. So 16A talks about recovery of immovable property. B talks about partition of immovable property. C talks about mortgage, which is like when we are dealing with foreclosure, sale, redemption, charge. All these cases relating to mortgage are to be filed in that jurisdiction where the immovable property is situated. D talks about determination of any other right relating to that immovable property. Now, any other right, I'll give you examples. The examples could be a case relating to injunction, often relating to an immovable property, or a specific performance of an immovable property. Then that would probably fall in section 16D. 16E talks about compensation for wrong to immovable property. Now, compensation for wrong to immovable property, for example, trespass, nuisance. These are compensation for wrong to immovable property. Now, 16F talks about a movable property. Now, this is an exception in section 16. 16A to E talks about immovable property, but 16F talks about movable property, which is actually under restraint or attachment. So when a movable property has been placed under a restraint order or attachment, the recovery of such movable has to be filed at the place where the movable property has been actually placed under attachment. Now, in this case, I can give you a citation. State of Assam versus Biraj Mohan. State of Assam versus Biraj Mohan. AIR 1965, Assam 35. So I'm repeating myself. 16F talks about a movable placed under restraint or attachment. Now, specifically, I'll talk about proviso. The proviso to section 16 talks about an immovable property which may be situated beyond the jurisdiction of the court where the suit has been filed. Then why it has been filed? Because 16A to E says that the suit must be filed where the immovable property is situated. But proviso says that here a suit has been filed not in a jurisdiction where the immovable property is situated, but in a jurisdiction where the relief can only be obtained through the personal obedience of the defendant. Now, this was one of the contentions in Harshad Chimanlal Modi's case. Now, since in that case, the defendant was DLF Universal and it had their corporate office in Delhi, a registered office in Delhi, sorry. In that case, the contention of the plaintiff was that it is validly filed in Delhi because the registered office of the defendant is in Delhi. And the relief can be obtained through the personal obedience of the defendant. The court said, of course, no. And they said that this proviso is not to be construed lightly. So again, the judgment is Harshad Chimanlal Modi versus DLF Universal. Now, coming to section 17, where the properties are situated at different places. Now, how are properties situated at different places? But a common cause of action arises in all of them. So, for example, a suit may be relating to a party.
Can we get the citation of Harshad Chimanlal matter?
Beta, this is AIR 2005 Supreme Court. I've already given the judgments. Again, after section 17 now.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
what I was saying is where the properties are situated at different places, but the cause of action is the same. So for example, a suit is relating to a partition, or a suit is relating to grant of a will, which includes multiple properties situated. Sorry, was this missed?
Yes,
You are not audible now.
Nitesh? Achha, I'm audible now. Do you want me to repeat section 17?
Yes, ma'am.
No. Am I audible?
Voice is breaking.
Ma'am, you are not audible.
Monica ma'am, can you hear me?
Can I
Monica
continue?
ma'am, can you hear me? Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you can.
Nitesh, am I
Ma'am,
audible?
yes. Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Audible and visible.
Section-
You can continue.
Okay. I will repeat section 17 again. Section 17 is where we are talking of cases where a cause of action relates to multiple properties. And I gave you two examples. One may be a partition, the other may be a will. So where you are asking for a probate or a LA for multiple properties situated at different places, or a partition of properties situated at different places. Then in such cases, which court will have jurisdiction? Now all those courts where the multiple properties are situated will have jurisdiction. Then which court? Every court can decide, but it has to be filed at one place. But please remember, this is a permissive section. You can file multiple suits at multiple places for different properties. But this section has no application where the cause of action has not arisen within its boundaries. So we are only talking about section 17 relating to multiple properties being situated in different parts, in different multiple jurisdictions. But it does not talk about multiple causes of action. Please remember that. So in this case, I will specifically refer to Nasir Ali versus Muhammad Ali. And I'm sorry, I do not have the citation just now, but I will be able to supply it a little later. Nasir Ali versus Muhammad Ali, a suit was filed to recover immovable properties. Now, some of which were outside the jurisdiction of the court. And he was claiming all these properties under a will. But for one of the properties, there was a second prayer which said that he should also be appointed as a muktawali of a waqf relating to one X property. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that the suit related to a will, say for A to D properties and also X property. But as far as X was concerned, another prayer was also mentioned by the plaintiff saying that please appoint me as a muktawali of waqf relating to that property. That the court said no, cause of action cannot be combined here. Just because you are filing a case relating to that property which is coming under the will, but multiple causes of action here cannot be combined really just because it refers to that particular property.
Does that mean that
No questions. Please, listener, no questions in between. The last 15 minutes are meant for questions.
So I'll continue with section 18 now. Now, where it is doubtful which of the two courts will have jurisdiction, then in that case, both of the courts can record the uncertainty, that there is an uncertainty relating to the boundaries of the jurisdiction, and continue to dispose of the matter, continue to decide the matter, and pass a decree which would be a valid decree. I am not getting into much of the detail of section 18. I'll try and concentrate to 19 and 20, looking at the time. So section 19, now it talks about movable properties, or movable, wrong done to a movable. Okay, so section 19 talks about suits where, may be instituted where wrong was done. Now, or where the defendant resides, carries on business, works for gain. Okay, so I'll begin with the first one. Wrong was done. What is a wrong? A wrong is basically an action which is violative of a legally recognized right. It is a actionable wrong to a person, to a movable property. So I'm specifically saying movable property, does not talk about immovable property here. So at times it may consist of a series of acts. It may not be just one act. It may be consisting of a series of acts. So when we have a series of acts, then all those places where the series of acts, wrongful acts have taken place, all these places get jurisdiction for the case to be filed. And it is also possible that wrong may have been done at one place, but the consequence of it is suffered at another place. Then again, in these cases, both the places get jurisdiction. Now, coming to defendant's residence. Now, defendant residence means basically where he's actually and voluntarily residing. Actually means really and not constructively. And voluntarily means of his own volition. So a person cannot be said to be voluntarily residing when he is in some kind of confinement. Then you cannot say that he is residing in that particular place. So basically, to constitute residence, two things must be present. One is a factum of residence, and the second is animus, basically element of intention. It signifies a permanent dwelling place where a man lives with his family, if he has any. It must be actual residence and not merely technical or constructive. Okay, now having said that, I have to clarify something here. It is only the defendant's residence which gives jurisdiction under CPC. But there are certain statutes which give jurisdiction even to the plaintiff's residence, but not under CPC. So one or two examples which I can give you where the plaintiff's residence also can get jurisdiction is maybe Family Courts Act or IPR. In these cases, the plaintiff residence can also make a difference. That means can get jurisdiction, but primarily it is under CPC, it is not the plaintiff's residence which gives jurisdiction. It is the defendant's residence which can give jurisdiction to a court. Now coming next to carries on business. Now business means some real or systematic or organized course of activity or conduct. Now this applies to both juristic as well as natural persons. Carrying on business could be applicable to both juristic as well as natural persons. Now carries on business again does not mean actually carrying on business by a person. He may be carrying on business through his agent. Now again, saying that if you have an agent at some place, but he carries on business for multiple people, but also carries on business for you, then that place will not get jurisdiction. That place would not mean that you are carrying on business at that place, because there is no exclusivity. When we say carrying on business through an agent, that actually means some exclusivity for that particular agent for giving that place jurisdiction. I hope I'm clear on that. Then the next is personally working for gain. Personally working for gain is where a person is gainfully employed. And again, not employed or confined to a particular occupation against his own volition. So that will not be covered. Now, coming to the most important section relating to jurisdiction, why I say important is, although it is residuary section, section 20. So if the case do not fall under 15 to 19, then only we should be using section 20. 28 talks about a situation where there are multiple defendants. How do we decide jurisdiction? So we decide jurisdiction of a place when there are multiple jurisdiction, all those places where each of the defendant carries on business, personally works for gain, residence, all these places get jurisdiction. So in other words, so if there are 3 defendants, 3 plus if they are carrying on business at some other place and personally working for gain at some other place. So in case of each defendant, there may be multiple jurisdictions which can be there to file case. And when there are multiple defendants, then this multiplies. So if there are 3 defendants, this can multiply up to 4 or 5 jurisdictions or 6 jurisdictions. Now, 20B talks about, again, the situation going further. What happens in cases where you file a case where only one defendant resides and the others do not reside there? Would it not be inconvenient for them to pursue their case in those jurisdictions? Now for this, when you file a case in a jurisdiction where only one of the defendant resides and the other defendants do not reside, you have to specifically mention that fact in the plaint and seek the leave of the court. Either the court will grant the leave, or if the case continues and there is no objection from the defendants not residing there in that jurisdiction, then it is assumed that the other defendants have agreed to the jurisdiction where the case has been filed. They have submitted themselves to the jurisdiction of the court where the case was filed. So this is important for 20B. Either a leave is granted or the defendants which do not reside within the jurisdiction of that court agree to that jurisdiction. So agreement may not be expressed. They will not come to the court and say, okay, I'm fine, you can pursue the case against me in this court. Agreement is implied when you do not raise an objection to jurisdiction. It is assumed that you have submitted yourself to the jurisdiction of the court. Now coming to 20C, cause of action. What is a cause of action? Cause of action means that set of circumstances which lead up to the suit. It is those facts which the plaintiff has to prove, has to allege, first allege and then prove in case he wants his plaint to be proved, or he wants the relief which he's praying for. So basically a cause of action arises when a legal right is infringed. And all those facts which are necessary for the plaintiff to prove that that legal right is infringed are leading up to cause of action. So bundle of facts which gives the right or liability. Now, whether a particular fact constitutes a cause of action or not is to be determined in relation to the allegation in the plaint. Since Nitesh had spoken to me about it, I will be referring to a few illustrations where I'll probably be able to show you how a cause of action is determined, or which are kind of facts which can be said or stated in the plaint, which can give jurisdiction to a particular case. So I'll be talking about 4 or 5 illustrations. So one is a suit for breach of contract, where you are asking for damages for breach of contract. Now, what should be alleged in such a case? One, that the defendant entered into a contract with the plaintiff. That is first fact. And secondly, that the defendant committed a breach of that contract. Now, if these 2 facts happened at one place, then that particular place only has jurisdiction. If these 2 facts happened at different places, then both these places will get jurisdiction. For example, A enters into a contract with B at Bombay and deliver goods, and the B is to deliver goods at Bombay. Then in that case, the entire cause of action has arisen in Bombay. But if he was to deliver goods at Chennai, then both Bombay, because where the contract was made, and Chennai, where the goods were to be delivered, will get jurisdiction. So part of cause of action arises in Bombay and part of cause of action arises in Chennai, because these are the 2 facts which are to be alleged and proved by the plaintiff in his plaint. Now, I'm giving another illustration on this. I'm adding one more fact to this. Suppose the contract was A entered in a contract with B at Bombay, and B was to deliver goods at Chennai, but was to make payment at Surat to C on behalf of A. Then in that case, a breach of this contract would give jurisdiction to 3 places: where the contract was made, where the payment was to be, where the goods were to be delivered, and third, where the payment was to be made. All these 3 places get jurisdiction. Now, in cases of a wrongful act or a tort, say for example, damages for a libel, then what is to be proved in this case? 3 facts. One, that the writing complained of, the libel that you are complaining of, was written by the defendant. 2, that it was false, it is untrue. 3, that is defamatory of the plaintiff. These are the 3 facts which the plaintiff needs to allege as well as prove when if the case is to be established. So any cause of action, any part of cause of action arising at any of these places where any of this has happened will get jurisdiction. Okay. Now, next illustration. Now, this is eviction under not any particular rent act, but an eviction under any law. Here, the landlord has to allege and prove 3-4 things. 1, that there is a relationship of landlord and tenant. 2, that the rent is above the statutory limit, so that it does not fall within the particular rent act. 3rd, that a notice was issued to the tenant and it was received by the tenant. And 4th, that the tenant, despite service, has not vacated the property. Now, all these places will get jurisdiction. Now, but if it is talking about a property here, now please see, here we are talking about recovery of immovable property. So section 16 will come into picture. and not 20. Because please remember, section 20 is a residuary section.
Right. Right.
Now, in cases of permanent injunction, what are the things which are to be proved by the plaintiff? That the plaintiff, permanent injunction where you're praying that you may not be forcefully evicted from a property. Then in that case, the plaintiff has to prove that he is in possession of the property, that his possession is not unauthorized, and that there exists a fairly good threat from the defendant where he has threatened him that he will be dispossessed without due process of law. Again, this particular problem would relate to an immovable property. Section 16 would come into picture. So I'll talk about another illustration where multiple jurisdictions can be there. Say for recovery of money by a bank, where a promissory note has been issued by a defendant. So what does the bank have to prove in these cases? One, that there is a transaction, there is an agreement between the bank and the defendant. Two, that money was actually lent under that agreement. Now, if it was lent at a particular place, that place gets jurisdiction. Where the agreement was signed, if it is a different place, that place gets jurisdiction. Where the defendant has defaulted in payment of money, that place would get jurisdiction. So, and of course, several other factors have to be proved, that a notice was sent, it was not replied to by the defendant, neither any payment was made, and then recall, the notice was recalled by the bank. all these factors are important for cause of action. Now, I wanted to come to the explanation, but prior to that, section 20 explanation is where a suit can be brought against a corporation at places where it carries on business. Now, where does a corporation carry on business? A corporation carries on business at several places. Wherever it carries on business and wherever it has subordinate office at such place, then by a statutory fiction in section 20's explanation, all these subordinate offices get jurisdiction. You can sue the corporation at that particular place where the subordinate office is situated. This is a statutory fiction. It is presumed that the corporation carries on business at the place of its subordinate office where the cause of action has arisen. Where the cause of action has arisen, this is important. But where the cause of action has not arisen at the place where the principal office is situated, then that place will not get jurisdiction. Now, in this regard, please, you can note a judgment. Patel Roadways Private Limited versus Prasad Trading Company, 1991, 4 within brackets, SCC 270. So you cannot simply file a case at a principal or place of principal jurisdiction of a corporation where there is no cause of action, where no cause of action has arisen. Now, the relevant date for determining a territorial jurisdiction is the date when you're filing the case. Now, the last thing about jurisdiction is the objections to jurisdiction. Now, objection to jurisdiction should be taken at the first possible opportunity, which is given under section 21, and latest by where till the issues are framed. And if it is not taken at the earliest possible opportunity and there has been a consequent failure of justice, and the court did not have jurisdiction relating to the subject matter of the suit, then the decree passed by the court is a nullity. So basically what I'm saying is that objections to jurisdiction has to be taken at the first possible opportunity. Nitesh, I think I have exceeded the limit.
No, it's not about exceeding the limit for me. Our lecture is so worthwhile of listening that there is no time limit we have kept for you. Well, if the listeners have any questions, I think we are waiting for the same. If they want to take up, they can take up one by one. I think there should not be a jumble and throwing of the questions. They can take it one by one. I request all the listeners, if they want to take out any question.
And Nitesh, if one thing
Yes, ma'am.
it could be clarified to them, it should not be specifically case related.
Yes. I once again repeat to the listeners that it should not be any case pertaining to an existing case. It should be relating to the lecture which has been delivered by Monica ma'am. So if the participants have any question, they can raise it now. The questions, I think, which were coming in their mind during the time of the lecture. Or shall I presume that none of you have any questions, that ma'am had explained in a way that everybody have got understood the entire lecture?
I have one question. My name is Amita.
Yeah, please raise.
Ma'am,
Yes, Amita.
You told about the suit wherein the relief claimed against multiple properties. So,
Yes.
Does that essential that the relief should be the same for all the properties?
I'm saying, I am not saying the relief should be the same. I am saying the cause of action should involve all the properties. If the cause of action does not involve all the properties, then it cannot be filed. It cannot be clubbed together.
There should be a single cause of action for all the properties.
Yes.
Common cause
Yes,
of action.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I have one relevant question.
Yes, please ask.
Sometimes we take the objection in 710 with regard to the return of the plaint for jurisdiction, and sometimes it has been taken in 711. So as per you, what is this best provision in which we should raise? Because generally if it is taken in 711, then court asks to raise it during the time or after the trial, or during the trial you should make out your case. So what should be the best thing we should do?
It should be 710.
Okay.
The plaint should be returned if it is not filed in a court of proper jurisdiction.
Okay. Yes, Rohan. Rohan, you can.
It starts de novo. Please remember, it starts de novo when the case is filed in the proper court.
Okay. Okay, ma'am. Yes, Rohan. I think you have raised the hand. You have some question. Rohan, if you can hear me. Okay, it was by mistake. So by this, I think I'm concluding today's lecture, as there are no more questions. So
Nitesh,
we are very thankful.
I have a question, Nitesh.
Who is this? Can you speak? Yeah, please.
Ma'am,
Monica, ma'am, over to you.
Yes,
ma'am, if we, ma'am, there is a side. So if we file objection under 710, and then that is, for example, it's not taken care, and then the limitation for 711, which talks about that, you have to file before the trial. What is the combination or the connection of 710 and 711 in such cases?
Could you elaborate a little more on that?
For example, you told that the jurisdiction objection should be taken in 710. However, some objections will come under 711. So how do we deal with two different situations in such scenario?
See, this is for the court to determine whether, if you have been able to bring out a case where you say that the plaint was filed not in a proper forum, then the end result would depend whether the case is being, if the plaint is being returned, it would be returned under Order 7 Rule 10. But if it is being rejected, then it would be rejected under 711.
Should we file 710, 711 together, or we should wait, first get 710 decided and then we work for 711?
In my view, it should be 710.
Okay.
Ma'am, just to supplement this, what the question was, when there is an express provision clearly stating in the act and the section, when we do not have, when the court has no jurisdiction, simply we will go in 710. Why we do have to interpret and go into 711? And just to support what ma'am has told, because to add on this, if you have a provision which is clearly mentioning the word when the court has no jurisdiction, then straight away you go under 710.
This audio is not.
Ma'am, are you? Am I audible? I put her on her behalf.
No, I think she's answering what Divya has.
Okay. Mane, I think you are not audible. If you can speak up again.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Now you are audible.
Okay. Just to supplement what ma'am has said and to little more clarify the doubt which was asked. So I wanted to just say that when we have a clear-cut provision in 710 which is using the word jurisdiction clearly, that when the court is not having jurisdiction, then we will simply return the plaint. In 711, we have other grounds of rejecting the plaint on other grounds, like we have 7-8 grounds, whatever we have. So I don't know why the confusion lies between 710 and 711. I mean, ma'am is completely correct. Just to ask you, why is there any confusion when we have a clear-cut provision in 710 just for on the ground of jurisdiction it is telling?
No, it is not. Manya, to answer that, it may not only be limited to jurisdiction, it may also come in cause of action, where it does not disclose a cause of action.
Cause of action.
So 710 will cover cause of action situations also.
No. 711.
Oh, 711 I'm clear about, yeah.
Yes.
The point was that whether we should institute 710 and 711 or 710 or 711. So ma'am has answered that first we should take care of 710, and if it's not taken, if it's clear, then we go to 711. That was the question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. I think by this we are concluding with today's lecture, and we are very much thankful to Monica ma'am to spare this time for us and delivering a wonderful lecture on from section 16 to 20 with the elaborate judgments and the illustrations on the point. Today, I think we are again remembering of the same day. Then we are sitting in the class and ma'am is starting at 16 to 20. I think by adding on the judgments and having it more clearer, ma'am, I think you have just explained 16 to 20 to everyone with the cause of action, which I specifically asked to be explained. Thanks a lot for this, ma'am, and we would be obliged to you for this. Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone who joined in this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.